What is up, producers? My name is Bo McLeod. I'm a producer and an educator, and I'm here today at 343 Labs to discuss how to make trap in Ableton Live. We have hybrid trap, we have original hip-hop induced trap, we have bass trap. There's so many different genres and types of trap today. However, all trap stems from the same place. Trap music originally came from the South around the mid-1990s. And it was kind of a stem off of hip hop. When we're talking about trap, we're using it as kind of a description for what our music is like. For instance, if we described our rock as classical, there's all different kinds of classical rock. We're really describing the feeling of something. So in trap music, we have about 4 or 5 elements that makes a song trap. The first element is going to be a hard-hitting low sub bass. So in our low frequencies, we typically have a big sub that's hitting very hardly in comparison to everything else. As far as the trap drums go, we're usually looking for some punchy drums that have heavy transients. With the trap hats, they usually move very quickly, and they're usually very transient heavy to be able to fit as many as we can in a certain spot. And then we typically have that paired with the melody or counter melody. The first thing we're going to do to initiate a trap track is get a melody going. We're going to build our melody first because this gives us a groove to build everything else off. So when we're writing a melody for trap music, we typically want to write in a minor key. The reason for this is typically with minor keys, it gives you kind of like that dark and sad and emotional kind of feeling. Whereas say writing in a major key might be more conducive to pop music or something more upbeat. So we're going to write in minor, and furthermore, we're going to write between the keys of D and F. The reason for this is because sub-bass frequencies resonate the best between D and F. These are the lowest we can get our sub-frequencies without them falling off on some speakers and sound systems. So we're going to start writing a melody in D, and to do that we're going to go ahead and grab a Ableton stock piano. That'll work. We're really looking for a sound that kind of matches that dark and ambient kind of trap feel we're going for. So this one sounds nice. In regards to BPM, 130 is usually a good starting place for trap. So we're going to go ahead and start with this, some of my amazing key playing here. And we're going to come in and we're going to quantize it. So if you're not at all familiar with music theory, that's totally fine. The only thing we're really going to be looking for here is that our first notes have this spacing. So this compared to this will dictate if our chord progression is major or minor. And like we talked about, we want to go with like that kind of dark and sad and trappy feeling. So we're going to stick with the minor. Once you know these 3 notes, you can put this anywhere on your piano roll, and that is going to make a minor triad. So if we shift this up 1, F sharp minor, G minor, G sharp minor. Once we know these intervals, we can utilize this to actually write an entire melody off. As you can see here, we mostly used only these 3 notes in writing this progression. So the next thing we're going to do now that we have our melody kind of cut out is we're going to go ahead and we're going to high pass it. We want to make as much room as possible for our 808 because like we talked about, we want a very big and present 808 in this kind of music. So what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and high pass this all the way to about 150, 200. The next thing we want to do is we want to give this a little bit more feel. So right now it's very dry, it's very straightforward, and we want it to have some movement because we want to keep our melodies interesting. We're going to utilize some of these parameters to keep this melody interesting and keep it moving. Next, we're going to utilize some delay to kind of give it some space. So when we're using spatial effects like reverb and delay to kind of put it in a spot and emphasize the size of it and the distance of it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start working on our 808. The 808 or the low frequencies typically represent like a feeling of grounding or landing. So kicks and 808s kind of have that grounded or landing feeling, where snare and kind of top end elements kind of feel like they're bringing you up. So we're going to go ahead and grab a Ableton stock 808. The sub 808 pitch boom is a great one to implement. So we're going to go ahead and drag that in. And circling back to the music theory of all this, so we know by looking at this that our root note is going to be the F. The ways you can usually determine your root note is it's typically the first note that you start off with in a chord progression. So you can see here we have our F, and then we have our F note down here. So that typically tells us right there that that's kind of our root note. And then we can also see that it's kind of a reoccurring theme in this melody. So we're going to go ahead and start our 808 off on the root note, which is F. So a couple rules we can abide by when writing our 808s are, first off, since it's the lowest frequency, we want it typically in mono, or at least we want the sub frequencies in mono. So when we leave something in mono, it typically gives it more power and it's more impactful. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that most of this 808, or at least the sub frequencies, are all in mono. The next rule we kind of want to abide by is typically 808s feel more impactful when there's little breaks between them. For instance, we don't want a consistent 808 because if we give it space until the next one, it's going to feel that much more impactful when it hits. Also, 808s love doing pitch bends and pitch dives. So notice just in this patch here, we have a little bit of movement and a little bit of wave to it. Also, portamento is great to utilize, which basically means when the notes are changing, it's going to bend up to that note instead of just cutting into that note. So notice we have glide on over here. So glide is going to be the same as portamento, to where it bends a little bit when it's going to the next note. So this 808's off to a good start, but we want it to be as loud and impactful as possible. To do this, we're going to use what's known as a frequency splitter. So what a frequency splitter is basically just two auto filters that meet in the middle. So this is one that I made. It's an auto filter that cuts off at 250 Hertz, and there's another one that cuts off at 250 Hertz. One's a low pass, one's a high pass, and they have about 14% resonance. That way there's no cutoff right in that space. The reason we're going to utilize this is because, as we've all probably seen the memes of putting reverb on sub bass, we typically don't want to process our sub bass too much. A little bit of saturation is fine, but we don't want to put reverb, spatial effects, or stereo imaging on the top end of our sub bass. However, when we separate these frequencies, the upper frequencies of the sub bass and the lower frequencies, this now gives us the flexibility to add some spatial effects and some imaging and whatnot to our sub bass. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and saturate it a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and grab a saturator. We're only going to put this processing on the upper frequencies of our sub bass. So a little bit of saturation. Now we're going to utilize erosion. So erosion kind of gives us like a noise, it kind of brings up like a fuzz to our sound. And we're going to utilize this to add some fuzz on the top end of our 808. And the reason we're going to do this is because, in my eyes, I think it adds kind of the illusion that the sub is clipping. So when we hear a sub that's clipping, on a system, or it's playing really loud through a speaker, we'll often get noise that comes along with it. And that kind of plays the trick on our ears that something's actually super loud. This sample is telling us that it's very loud, even though it might not necessarily be that loud decibel-wise. So we're going to go ahead and crank this up, and we're going to put it on wide noise because, like we talked about, now that we're only affecting the upper frequencies of the sub bass, we have the flexibility to add a little bit of width to it. Now, like we talked about, since we split the frequencies, we can actually add a little bit of reverb on the upper part of the sub bass. I like to use a convolution reverb because convolution reverb emulates certain spaces. So we can kind of utilize this to put our sound in a space. Like we had talked about before, reverb will put something in a space and give it dimension and distance. So if we're using a reverb that puts us in a space that might resonate with us in relation to how this track's supposed to feel, that's going to add to the overall feel of the track. So say if we go down here to places, a warehouse. So a warehouse might be a place that we might associate with like a trappy feeling. So we're going to go ahead and do that, but what we're going to do is we're going to use parallel reverb. We don't want the upper part of this track to be completely wet and reverb. So we're going to Command G and group it. Then we're going to create a chain and name it dry. And then this one's going to be wet. This allows us to maintain the original signal, the original dry signal of our track, while still adding some reverb. So once again, we're going to put this just on the upper frequencies of our sub bass. And we're going to kind of just add this to feel. And this is just the upper frequencies of our sub bass. So now if we unmute the lows and play everything. A good rule of thumb for our sub bass is we typically want it down about 4 dB when we're starting out, because the sub bass is kind of like our roof or our ceiling. So our sub frequencies are going to hit the highest on our EQ. So because of that, when our sub is fully hitting, that kind of limits us to how loud everything else can be, because we're already kind of hitting our ceiling. So a good rule of thumb for your 808s is I usually start them out at about -4 dB, and this gives us a little bit of headroom to work with. So now that we have a basic piano melody and a basic 808 subline, what we're going to do is we're going to start adding drums. So the first thing I would do, I would add a kick that matches the 808. I'm going to go ahead and use a Cymatics free pack. It's called Cymatics Trap Starter. There's not really any trap drums that come stock in Ableton that we necessarily love, so I usually like to outsource for my trap drums. So this is a free pack from Cymatics called Trap Starter Pack. You can go grab it from their website. Everything on here is free. And we're going to go ahead and find a kick that works for us. So because we already have this huge 808, we don't necessarily want a kick with a lot of body. We just want a short, punchy kick that's going to kind of work good with that 808. We're going to get back into these and kind of add a little bit of groove to them, but first let's kind of build out the foundation of our drum loop. So sometimes drums are tonal and sometimes they're not necessarily super tonal. What I mean by that is sometimes they'll have a formant, which is the main frequency, that really kind of resonates and sounds like a key to us. Sometimes they don't. These ones do, and that's why they tell us here that this one's an F, this one's an A sharp, this one's in D sharp. So what we're going to do is we're going to use one that's an F, that's in our root. So what we're doing here is we're going to go ahead and pitch one of these down an octave and turn it down a little bit. A very big aspect of this type of music is kind of like feel and groove in the drums. And basically groove can be described as changes in the pitch, the velocity, the volume, and where it's sitting on the track or the track delay. Groove is what really gives you like that head noddiness. If we put everything directly on grid, it's just going to sound too robotic. And that groove really gives it like that shuffle and that feeling we're looking for. So I like to spend a lot of time going through my drums and pitching things, shortening the sample, making the sample more quiet and moving it off grid just a little bit. So that's kind of what we started here with this last snare. We went ahead and turned it down by about 4 dB. We pitched it down about an octave. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and scoot it off grid just a little bit. So we're going to hold command and hit the right arrow about 3 times. It's going to make it sound a little bit late, but this is actually going to like add and emphasize the groove and the feeling of the track. Maybe move back a little bit. Next, we're going to go ahead and add our hats, and this is a very large aspect of what's going to make something sound trappy or not. A very big qualifier for trap music is like those very fast and transient heavy hi-hats. Another very big aspect of trap is the triplet, which I'll show you now. So to change our grid from standard grid to triplet grid, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hit Command 3. So now this is going to put our grid in triplet, which allows us to just line these up. And now we're going to have a nice triplet roll here. And we'll do a faster one here. And there's not really a limit to how fast we can do our hats in this style of music. Some people really just crank them up and do them really fast. So we're going to go ahead and do one that's super fast here. So now that we have a basic closed hi-hat pattern, we're going to go ahead and accent it with an open hat. So one very important thing that I've learned over the years, the quickest way to make something uncool is to do it too much or have too much repetitiveness. So we're going to do everything we can to add as much movement and shuffle to these drums as we can without going overboard. Notice I'm going to do things like come in here and pitch every other open hat down 3 and turn it down and shorten it a little bit. These little things are really going to help us build our groove. So a general rule of thumb in music, especially trap, is like we talked about, we want our lowest frequencies right in the middle. So we typically want our lowest frequencies hitting in mono, so they're hitting as hard as they possibly can. Then that rule also applies to our upper frequencies. So when we're talking about hi-hats, percussive elements, anything on top, you can really utilize stereo imaging to push those to the side. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a very wide stereo image. So we have our sub bass and our kick in the middle. We're going to put our melody a little bit panned out so that's kind of on the side. And then we can really crank the stereo image on these hi-hats and put them really far on the side. What we're going to do to take advantage of this is we're going to go ahead and utilize what's known as the Haas effect. So what the Haas effect is it's actually a delay that delays one speaker milliseconds from the other. And what that does is it actually tricks our ears into thinking that something's super wide because the signal's coming just a little bit after the other signal. So there's actually a stock Ableton Max for Live device called the Hubert Haas effect. And all we have to do is crank up this delay time a little bit. Now if you have headphones on, you can hear how wide these hi-hats are sounding. And what that's doing is that's giving us all this space in the middle to fill up with our melody, to fill up with our sub bass. So it's really giving us a lot of room to put things in. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of movement into these hats. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize a shifter, which is a frequency shifter. And that's going to allow us to manipulate the frequencies and the pitches of the hi-hat so we can give them that kind of trappy pitch down and pitch up we hear kind of throughout it. And again, that's going to kind of keep it interesting and keeping our percussive elements moving. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it on pitch and we're going to map coarse to show automation. And we're just going to gently add dips, typically where there's like a roll. Now we want to make sure that there's no low frequencies at all in our hats. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a high pass. So we're going to grab an EQ8 and we're going to cut everything pretty high, around 1K. So now what we're going to do to kind of finalize the groove and the movement on our hi-hats is we're going to implement what's known as an Ableton groove. So this is a really cool and unique feature that is unique to Ableton. And what it does is it allows you to implement a pre-built groove directly onto your audio or MIDI track. So what I mean by that is kind of circling back to when we were talking about groove being changes in pitch, changes in volume, and moving things off grid and everything. It has pre-made grooves that we can actually come in here and cycle through. I have a favorite one, which is MPC double down 16ths 55. And if we just drag and drop this directly onto our hi-hat track, we can actually hear the difference. So it's very subtle, but you can notice that if you listen closely, instead of playing the same velocity note every time, so instead of playing like the same loudness and the same spot on the grid, it's giving us just a little bit of movement. So these are called MPC because they kind of emulate if someone was playing on an MPC, which is like a finger drumming machine, and that's really going to like give it some liveliness and some movement. So that's with, and this is without. Then we're going to go ahead and add one more percussive element because the percussion in this kind of music is really what's going to like move the track along and glue everything together. So let's go ahead and go back to our cymatics pack and we're going to grab a cymbal. A cool trick with cymbals is you can actually reverse them and it kind of becomes like a sweep. So the last thing we're going to do with our top end elements, so our hi-hat, open, and our crash, is we're going to go ahead and group them. I like to group them and name this tops. When it comes to grouping, I like to group things based on how I'm going to process or treat them. So these are our very highest elements. So always with my tops, I go ahead and just again, we're going to cut out all the lows. And then we're going to add a little bit of glue compression to kind of just glue all these sounds together. So what a glue compressor kind of does is it's going to decrease the dynamic range of all these sounds. So if there's any peaks that are louder than the rest, it's going to allow us to kind of like glue all those together to give them kind of like a common dynamic and a more similar volume level. So just some light peak cap. We're going to reduce the threshold just enough to get a little bit of gain reduction. And then because our hats aren't necessarily in the front of our stereo image, this allows us to put a little bit of reverb on them to push them back a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of reverb here, maybe some convolution again. It's not a bad idea to keep a theme when you're using like convolution reverbs or reverb in general. So we had already put the Terry's Warehouse on the upper frequencies of the 808. We're going to go ahead and put that on our hats. And because we're not necessarily trying to keep these up front, it's okay to not use parallel reverb in this situation. We're going to go ahead and just put the reverb directly on the track. And we're going to put it at about 20% and see how that sounds. We're going to put it at about 10% dry wet, and then we're going to use a little bit of pre-delay, just enough to let those transients in before playing the reverb. Then the very last thing we're going to do with our percussive elements are we're going to go ahead and utilize track delay to push them back just a little bit. So we're taking all of our elements here and we're going to delay them just a little bit. And it's going to make them sound a little bit lazy and a little bit late. That's really going to add a little bit of feel to the track overall. So we're going to put this at 20. So one thing we should have done earlier in the track that we're going to do now is we're going to sidechain compress our 808 to our kick. So we want the 808 to duck just enough for the kick to come in, sometimes a little bit more, because that little bit of space between the kick and the 808 really makes the kick feel more impactful. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to our 808 and we're going to minimize this processing. And we're going to add a compressor, sidechain, and we're going to use our kick as our input signal. So what this is going to do is it's going to compress or turn down the sub every time the kick hits. So it's going to draw the signal in from the kick and it's going to turn that sub down. This way it also kind of prevents us from clipping, because since our kick and our 808 live in a lot of the same frequencies, it's going to prevent it from getting that peak that's going to make us clip on our master. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize the threshold, the attack, and release to get the exact feeling we're going for. So attack is how quick the compression takes place. So we typically want it very fast, but we don't want it perfectly at 0, because that can sometimes give us a little bit of clipping and noise. So we're going to keep it at 0.03, and then we're going to play with the threshold and the release to get that perfect duck we're looking for. So notice the higher we crank the release and the lower we dip the threshold, that's going to give us like more of a space between the kick and the sub reaching back to its full volume. So doing this, kind of like I was saying, allows the kick to sound like bigger. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this compressor and we're going to put it on our tops as well, and our melody. And what this is going to do is it's going to make everything duck when the kick hits, and that's going to make the kick sound super impactful. Now we don't necessarily want it that dramatic on all the tracks, so we'll come over here to our melody and we'll go ahead and turn the release down a little bit and just get a little bit of ducking here. Same thing with the tops. We're just going to turn the release down, turn this up, and just get a little bit of ducking. So we're going to go ahead and kind of what I like to call putting on the pants of our drums. So we're going to go ahead and group all these drums and we're going to group process them. So group processing allows you to kind of give all your elements a similar vibe or a similar feeling. So that way they feel like they're coming from the same place, they're coming from the same kit, and it's going to make them all sound a lot more cohesive. So what I like to do is I like to do a little bit of saturation on them just to kind of glue all of them together. Again, a little bit of glue compression to kind of just catch those peaks. And then to add a little bit more movement on the snare, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of reverb throws. So that's going to kind of go ahead and give it like some movement, some push and pull. So we're going to automate this reverb. And the last thing I like to do in my drum group is I like to make sure everything's sitting on the right spot and it's the right volume level. So based on looking at this and listening to it, I would say that everything's sitting in the right spot, so we can go ahead and move on. And then last thing I'll do is go ahead and crank a little bit of parallel reverb in this. I would say when in doubt, add a little bit of reverb into Ascend into pretty much almost anything, and it kind of puts it in that space and keeps it from being a completely dry signal, even though we already put a little bit of reverb on our tops. So the last thing we're going to go ahead and do on the speed is we're going to add a little bit of a chant to it. So a chant, again, is kind of like a foundational building brick of trap music. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my sample library and just search for a hey. Decap hey, that'll work great. So we're going to utilize what's known as ghost notes on this chant, and ghost notes are basically utilizing the same sound but at half the volume, and that's going to kind of give it that push-pull and that feeling we're looking for. So we're going to go ahead and turn this down -10. Duplicate that. And we're going to track delay it so it's a little bit late again. And then we're going to go ahead and utilize an auto pan to keep it kind of moving from the side to side. Like we talked about, we want to give everything as much movement as possible without getting distracting. So we're going to put an auto pan on it. So these are pretty much the building blocks of a trap song. This is a pretty basic kind of beat, but I kind of wanted to give you guys a feel for the elements that are super important. So once again, to kind of recap what we learned, we typically want to write in a minor key and kind of build off that. That'll give us that kind of like down, trappy kind of vibe. A lot of movement in our drums is really going to kind of make or break our trap song. So pitch, utilizing track delay, utilizing stereo imaging and movement and some reverb, very important. That big thumping 808 is going to be very important in giving us that feel we want. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.